Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to the very first episode of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and I'm a medieval historian with a passion for storytelling. Today, I want to start a journey with you. I want to be your guide while we travel on the paths of history, looking for myths, legends and heroes that have contributed to the history of the European countries. We're not just going to follow the highways of history. We're not just going to meet great heroes and heroines like William Tell, Joan of Arc, or Giuseppe Garibaldi. I would also very much like for us to get lost on the smaller paths, following rumors and hearsay, and discover that behind the history with a big H, there are hundreds, thousands of smaller stories which might look insignificant on their own, but together have the power to shape a nation. If you're ready to start on this journey with me, then welcome aboard. And no, put down that pen and that notebook because you won't need them. Dates and data are necessary, of course, but if you keep an open mind and you're not distracted by other things, you can get to know wonderful people and places that will enrich you. That said, fix your headphones, lock your phone, and get ready to follow me to one of the steepest countries in Europe to meet one of the most well-known heroes in possibly the entire world. Let me welcome you, my fellow travelers, to Switzerland, home to William Tell. Why Switzerland, you ask? Well, I could wax poetry about the mountains and the lakes and the forest, or I could tell you that the Swiss hero we're about to meet was so popular during the French Revolution and subsequently during the American one, although in a much more limited capacity, that he can be considered a European hero, not just a Swiss one. Or I can tell you a less grand, but much truer version of the story. I live in Switzerland, and when I started this project, the very first hero who came to mind was William Tell. So much so that the title of the podcast is a reference to him. He is very much still a part of daily life for Swiss people, and his ubiquitous and slightly overbearing presence in the modern world has made me curious to see if there were other heroes or heroines, legends or myths that permeate our life today without our conscious knowledge. That he also has a fascinating story only made him even more perfect for being the very first hero of this podcast. But I will let history speak for itself. It's time for us to start our journey. It is a small, steep country, much more up and down than sideways. This was how Ernest Hemingway described Switzerland in an article for the Toronto Daily Star in March 1922. If you've never been to Switzerland, you might think those are really unflattering words. But if you visited, even just once, then you know that behind every great vista, there's always a very steep ascent. If you still think Hemingway too harsh, you might want to take into consideration that when he uttered those words, he had just received news that all of his unpublished work until that moment, the work that should have been his greatest breakthrough and triumph, had been stolen, right underneath the nose of his first wife, Hadley. That he went on to become a master is due to his incomparable talent, but we will never truly know what those works were, since they were never found again. Considering that he later claimed to have divorced his wife due to this, well, I think Switzerland got off lightly, don't you? I'm not quite sure, on the other hand, what prompted Mark Twain's description of the country. Switzerland is simply a large, lumpy, solid rock with a thin skin of grass stretched over it. Way less flattering than Hemingway, right? Although probably very much in tune with the rest of the book from which this quote comes from. The US author had travelled through Switzerland at the end of the 19th century and had published a record of his travels in 1880 with the title A Tramp Abroad. The entire book is full of dry humour and wit, and if it is your style, it makes for an entertaining read, though perhaps a really out of date one. There are some things in there, though, that have withstood time better than others, and I think this description is one of those. Anybody who's visited Switzerland can attest that the mountains are granitic, and sometimes you need to be a mountain goat to find your next meal. After hearing such descriptions, one might be inclined to think that Swiss history has been buried underneath an avalanche of too many rocks and not enough grass. And yet, exactly in between those rocks, in the valleys protected by the giant mountains, the Swiss have kept their greatest treasures. No, not gold. Switzerland is not a country of highways, but of steep paths, and its history mirrors this. To find the heroes, the legends, the myths, we need to put on our best hiking shoes, fill our canteens with water, and follow the voices that call to us from around a fire. The very first story I want to tell you is the story of a man, a humble member of the least represented but very much alive category of people of the past. He was but a simple peasant, known to his fellow villagers for his prowess with a bow and for his sometimes exaggerated boasting. When confronted with an authority with the power to crush him, he stood defiant in front of it, trading barbs rather than cowering in fear. There are lots of chronicles, both ancient and new, telling us his story. His fame derives mostly from one single act, but his legend is beloved and his name a trademark in modern Switzerland. Today, as I've already said, I'm very excited to introduce to you the legendary crossbowman William Tell, and of course, his apple. The story of William Tell is fairly straightforward, but his legacy, the role he still has today, is slightly more complicated. I will touch upon this subject later in the episode, but for now I think you'll all agree with me that if there was something that represented Switzerland as well as chocolate or cuckoo clocks, it would be this medieval hero, his crossbow and his apple. And yet, this famously Swiss hero might not have been Swiss at all. And in an even more surprising turn of events, he might have never wielded a crossbow, but a simple bow. And even more shocking, the apple might not even be an apple at all, but a walnut. Imagine the title of this podcast, The Walnut and the Hero. Yeah, no, somehow I don't think it has the same ring to it. Jokes aside, before you leave this podcast because you think I'm fibbing, we better take the story from the very beginning. And so, the first two characters I need to introduce to you have nothing to do with Switzerland at all. To be fair, when they lived in the 11th century, Switzerland as a country didn't even exist. Our two characters are Eindridi and Hemming, two Norwegian hunters who had the bravery, or the bad luck depending on the point of view, of running afoul of the temper of two Norwegian kings. There isn't much written about Eindridi that I could find, at least not in a language that is not of runic descent, but from what I gathered, he was a pagan, and King Olaf the Saint wanted him to convert to Christianity. Since words had had little effect on Eindridi up until that point, King Olaf had decided to propose a series of complicated physical challenges that Eindridi had to perform against an adversary. If Eindridi could overcome the majority of them, he could keep worshipping the old gods, but if he failed, then he would have to embrace Christianity and convert. As one might have expected, Eindridi demurred, citing youth and lack of experience, but King Olaf was not to be dissuaded. Even worse, after having decided that the very best way to judge the contest was to directly participate in it, the king decided that he himself was going to be Eindridi's adversary. I can imagine that our Norwegian farmer might have been slightly less than enthusiastic about the prospect of challenging his king. I mean, no one wants to overshadow a monarch, especially not one who was known as the lawbreaker, for his many brutal ways of converting the Norwegian populace to Christianity. But since his religious freedom was on the line, and with it also his freedom in general and the safety of his family, Eindridi accepted the challenge and gave it his all. Apparently, Olaf hadn't reached the position of king just because he looked pretty on a throne, so at the end of the day, they had both won one challenge each. To break the stalemate, King Olaf proposed the last challenge. Using a boy Eindridi cared about as a pedestal, they were both to shoot an arrow aimed at a chess pawn placed at the top of the boy's head. Now, chess pawns in the past were no bigger than they are now. And still, King Olaf took the shot and hit the piece, not without also grazing the boy's scalp, but according to the chronicles, the king seemed to have paid scarce attention to such detail. Eindridi tried to demur again, but the king would not hear about it, so our farmer hero reluctantly positioned himself to take the shot. But while he had been incapable of denying his king, Eindridi's mother and sister held no such compunction. They begged him not to take the shot, and with much cajoling they persuaded Eindridi not to go through with it. Of course, this meant that he had lost the challenge and thus the right to his faith, but I'm pretty sure that the boy's life had been better for it. The story of Hemming goes much the same way. What we know comes from two ballads, one from the Faroe Islands and one from Iceland. Much like the evil queen in Snow White, who scours the land through her mirror looking for someone who could equal her in beauty, King Harald Hardrada, meaning the hard or stern ruler, was obsessed with power and physical prowess. Unlike the evil queen in Snow White, the moment a possible rival appeared, our Hemming, King Harald didn't order his immediate death, but went to confront the boy in person. If it still wasn't clear for the story of Eindridi, ancient Norwegians were obsessed with physical competitions. So King Harald challenged young Hemming to an archery competition, followed by a ski competition. Well, one might argue that this could be considered the very first biathlon challenge. It is the archery competition which interests us, for Hemming is the one whose target was the famous walnut which had been put on the head of his brother. Unlike Eindridi, who had been persuaded not to shoot, Hemming took the shot and managed to split the nut and knock his brother's head. Before you all think this story has at least an happy ending, Contrary to Andridi's tale, let me tell you what happened in the ski competition that followed. The objective was to see who between Hemming and King Harald could ski the fastest down the Snarafjell mountain. Out the starting gates, they seemed to be evenly matched, and according to the stories, until halfway down the mountain, nobody seemed to be able to take a clear lead. Then, whether on purpose or by accident, we don't know, Hemming knocked the King Harald off the course, thus winning the competition. Of course, those weren't times in which one could simply bump a king out of the way without consequences, and so rather than winning the entire thing, the story ends with Hemming running for his life. At this point, you might be wondering what these two Nordic heroes have got in common with the Swiss peasant who was punished for defying the Habsburgs' authority. There is a particular feat of marksmanship in German folklore, which is commonly known as the Apfelschluss, or the apple shot. As the name implies, it involves an apple, and it showcases the ability of the marksman in hitting said apple. The stories vary, as do the abilities of the marksman. Some hit a stationary target, some a moving one. Where did the apple come from, though? Eindridi and Hemming had used a chess piece and a walnut, respectively. Who was the first one to prove his worth with the Apfelschluss? For this story, we still need to remain in the north of Europe, in Denmark this time, in the company of Palnatoke, or else known as Toki the Archer. Once again, a staunch believer in the old religion, this time though, the quarrel that Toki had with his king, whose name was Harald Bluetooth, yes, the very same one whose rune is now used to signal the connection between two devices, was not religious in the slightest, but political, at least in part. The archer had been entrusted with the care of Svein Forkbeard, son of Harald Bluetooth, and famous for the forked beard, which became his moniker. Father and son did not see eye to eye on many things, and like other stories before and after, the son revolted against the father. Toki took arms in service of Svein, even if it had been Harald, the king to whom he owed his career. Why the change of heart? One so profound that there are some versions of the story in which it is Toki himself who kills Harald Bluetooth. Well, it all comes down to an apple. People from the north of Europe will have to forgive me, but as far as I could see, Nordic men of old liked two things: drinking and boasting. When combined, these two have started more than one illustrious saga. The story of Toki the Archer starts, like many others, with a drunken boast. "I am the best shot in the land," was what a drunken Toki brazenly stated one evening in front of his king. Worse still was what came out of his mouth next. "I can shoot an apple off the top of a pike on the other side of the hall." Maybe King Harald Bluetooth was just as drunk. Maybe he was sober and feeling petty at this boasting. Whichever it was, it ended up with Toki's son, not just a pike, being used as a pedestal for an apple, which his father had to shoot off his head. In truth, Toki had not boasted in vain. His shot was true, with the apple neatly cleaved in the middle and no hair torn from the boy's head. Evidently, Harald Bluetooth was feeling magnanimous that night, because no retaliation came, not even when the archer candidly admitted that he would have gladly killed his king with the 2 arrows he had hidden in his vest if his shot had not hit the intended target. For King Harald, the incident could be considered closed with no consequences. He entrusted his son to Toki, a high honor for any soldier, and that was it. Apparently not for Toki, though, who nursed this grudge, this careless order to shoot at his child for all his life, until he plunged his sword in King Harald's chest on his son's orders. This version of the tale is the one closer to the story of William Tell. 1 apple, 2 arrows, and the final revenge. Of all the versions of the Affelschluss, the one featuring the Swiss hero, William Tell, is the most well-known. It is one of the very few medieval stories which benefited from a second wind in the 19th century. Many of you probably have never read the play Wilhelm Tell that German-born writer Friedrich Schiller wrote in 1804. But I will wager that all of you are at least tangentially familiar with the overture from the Guillaume Tell, a French opera in 4 acts by Italian composer Gioacchino Rossini. It is, after all, the intro piece of this podcast. If you didn't pay attention at the beginning, I'll quiet myself for a moment and let you listen. At this point, we have met the heroes who came before, their weapons, their target objects, their motives. It is time to introduce the main character of this episode, the Swiss hero William Tell. So what is his story? What did he do and why did he do it? And how much does modern-day Switzerland owe to this hero? And last but not least, and most important question, did he even exist in the first place? The story of Wilhelm Tell, how is he called in German, takes place in the middle of the 13th century, in the small village of Altdorf in Canton Uri, in central Switzerland. This village, like half of Central Europe at the time, was part of the Holy Roman Empire. The emperor usually resided in Germany, and without the capacity for teleporting, it couldn't be all over his empire at the same time. The only way to keep an eye on things, even when far away, was to divide the empire in smaller territories, which were then assigned to noble families. The family who got assigned the territories of central Switzerland, which roughly consist of the cantons of Schwyz, Uri, Nidwald and Obwald today, was the Habsburg family, a Swiss noble family whose first seat of power was located in the Swiss canton of Aargau. If you like nature and forests and tall mountains with crystalline lakes and amazing views, you might be tempted to say that the Habsburg had indeed been very lucky. Even luckier than those poor nobles who had received the north of Italy with the swamps and the humidity and the never-ending mosquitoes. Unfortunately for the Habsburg, though, while beautiful, those natural wonders made for a very poor territory, whilst the mosquito-infested plains of the north of Italy were indeed very rich. It feels weird to say this today, but Switzerland as a whole was a very poor country in the Middle Ages. Wealth in those times came from agriculture, and as much as Switzerland is a natural wonder, the steep mountains and narrow valleys don't make for good ploughing fields, especially in central Switzerland. What attracts tourists today was exactly what made the territories assigned to the Habsburg the poorest a noble family could receive. Masters of such a poor territory though they were, the Habsburg was still a noble family, and so they needed money and wealth to keep up their status. And if the land wasn't gonna give them wealth, they could always squeeze it from the people. Every territory under a ruler only interested in wealth will inevitably suffer, and central Switzerland was no exception. In the middle of the 13th century, the people had reached their breaking point, and rebellion was simmering. And the breaking point for our hero, William Tell, was apparently a hat. One day, William Tell was crossing the town of Aldorf with his son Walter next to him and his crossbow slung over his shoulder. The pair had been coming home from a hunt, the only way people could hope to put something on their tables under the unchecked rule of the Habsburg. He might have seen it and ignored it. He might have not even noticed it was there. What is true in both cases is that William Tell passed by the hat belonging to the bailiff Gessler and which had been put on a pole without bowing in front of it. I don't know about you, but I would have barely spared a look if I had found something like this in my path, let alone taken a bow at it. Such a gesture, or lack of one, would almost cost William Tell everything. Bailiff Gessler was a vain man who wanted to be revered, even when he wasn't there in person to receive the accolades, or so the stories go. He had purposefully left his hat as a totem for the peasants to look at and treat as if it were the Lord himself. When Tell had barely spared a glance for it, Gessler felt as if the bowman had ignored him in person. Treason, the act of speaking or acting against the king, the queen, or one's lord, was a pretty common crime in the Middle Ages, and the punishment for it was severe. By not bowing to the hat, William Tell had run afoul of this very crime. While Gessler could not justify the usual punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering in this case, he wanted the man to suffer. What better way, then, than to toy with a man's family? Gessler could not justifiably put William Tell and his son Walter to death, but with a prison sentence hanging over their head, the bailiff presented Tell with the option of redeeming himself. Tell accepted, sight unseen, only to find out that such a redemption scheme involved putting his son in even more danger than a dungeon. Like King Olaf and the two King Harald in the Nordic Chronicles, Gessler put an object on the child's head, the famous apple, as it turned out, and told William to shoot at it. If he managed to hit it, he would win both their freedoms. If not, well, William would go to prison knowing he had killed his own son. The legend says that William Tell was a very good shot, but what he needed to do was a little bit difficult. Like some of the heroes before him, Tell took the shot, and the bolt cut the apple in two neat halves, without the boy losing even a single hair. I cannot imagine the face of the bailiff in the moment the shot hit. Along with the apple, William Tell had also halved Gessler's authority. The bailiff could not stand such an insult. Many interpret what happened next as some naivete on the bailiff's part, probably because this part is practically identical to the story of Toki the Archer. But I personally don't think so. The legend says that Gessler took notice of the fact that Tell had selected two bolts, one for the apple and the other still in his hands. When pressed for an explanation, the crossbowman candidly admitted, if not directly boasted, that he would have gladly used the second bolt on Gessler himself if the first one had ended up hitting the wrong target. For some, the fact that Gessler had openly asked Tell the reason of the second bolt can be interpreted as the bailiff being dumb, but I think there was another reason. Gessler had lost face twice, and he had also lost the opportunity to punish the insolent peasant who had mocked him. Punishing Tell after he had given him his word to let him go would erode what was left of Gessler's authority. The bailiff needed a pretext, and he knew that Tell was a simple man and that he would boast his plan for revenge. When Tell openly admitted he could have murdered Gessler readily, the bailiff had his crime. Incidentally, this was why I told you at the beginning that William Tell might have been just a simple bowman. A crossbow wasn't a weapon for the peasants at this point of time in the 13th century, and with the crossbows of the past, there was no way one could shoot 2 bolts in sequence without spending at least 10 minutes between one and the others to recharge the crossbow. Knowing this, I think you can all agree with me that probably the legendary weapon was not a crossbow at all, but a bow. Back to the story, though. Another contest was clearly out of the question. Who knew what the other talents Tell might have been concealing? So the bailiff went directly for imprisonment. Aldorf possessed no prisons, so Tell was moved towards Gessler's castle on the Immensee. The legend states that during the transfer, when the boat was in the middle of the lake, a great storm hit, with black waves towering over the small craft. The bailiff and the guards had no idea how to steer the boat to safety, but Tell did. He bargained for his freedom, promising to bring them all to shore if Gessler would free him of his bonds. The situation must have clearly been a desperate one, because Gessler readily agreed, and so, free once again, Tell took the helm. In a way, the bowman kept his promise. He did steer the boat to the shore. He just chose one of the rockiest part of it. When the boat was close enough to almost crash on the rocks, Tell jumped to the shore, while the boat, with no helmsman to steer, was pushed into the wavy lake once more. In the end, Gessler and the soldiers managed to make landfall relatively unscathed and made for his castle inland. It was on the road from the lake to the castle that our story came to an end. Having managed to land before them, Tell intercepted Gessler's party on the way and, as promised, planted the other arrow in the bailiff's chest, thus handing the Habsburg rule over central Switzerland and giving way to the Swiss Confederation, or so the legend says. I could finish the story here, leave you all with a sort of happily ever after. But history, my fellow travellers, is rarely this lucky. In the most ironic reverse of fate possible, Tell drowned while he was trying to save a child. Still a hero, even at the cost of his life. It doesn't take a keen eye for detail to notice that there are many similarities between William Tell's story and the tale of Toki the Archer. The insensate punishment, the apple, the 2 arrows. If we were talking about sciences, then 2 tales are so eerily similar to each other would be the best proof that something had indeed happened in that way. History, however, doesn't work quite like this. Rather than make the story more credible, the fact that multiple copies of it exist declares it fake. It would be irresponsible for historians to just dismiss William Tell as a copy of another older hero with the same attributes. So research has been done to prove his existence, or lack of thereof. The fact that other stories identical to this exist is clearly not a good sign. and it was the main argument against the existence of William Tell in the 18th century. The pamphlet, entitled William Tell, A Danish Fable, published in 1760, based its entire case on the existence of the story of Toki the Archer, and how this fact undermined the very soul of the Swiss bowman. While not wrong, this argument alone is flimsy, and so modern historians had tried a more thorough approach. I think everyone would agree that one of the conditions to exist as a flesh and blood person is to have been born. Regardless of how much dark and ignorant the Middle Ages are perceived today, they were also an era in which information was carefully kept. And no information was more scrupulously kept than the parochial archives. Those books contained the name of every parishioner who had been born, had lived, and had died in a given parish. The historians had postulated that if the name Wilhelm Tell, or even just the family name Tell, could be found in these books, then this would be the clearest confirmation of the bowman's existence. Historians, archivists, and paleographers have all combed through all parochial archives in central Switzerland, from 200 years before William Tell's supposed date of birth to 200 years after. The results of this endeavour? Well, nothing at all. While Wilhelm was a very common first name, there is no sign of a family bearing the name Tell, or another variation thereof. Some might argue that books have gone lost before, and I would agree. But not every book was lost, and even if we had lost the ones which might have held Tell's name inside, we should have been able to find his descendants. A man who wasn't born cannot have lived. The bowman from Cantonuri is but a legend. Does his non-existence, though, detract anything from his myth? I personally don't think so, and neither do the Swiss. Whether he existed or not, his figure is inextricably linked with the history of Switzerland. Historians have argued that William Tell is Switzerland. He is the country, trying to find itself, to establish its values, to show its courage, to free itself from somebody else's clutches. William Tell might owe his bow and his apple to the Nordic heroes of old, but the struggle he represented, that desperate wish for freedom from an unjust and suffocating power, well, that was all Swiss. What about now? Today? Has William Tell faded into the oblivion of history like so many others before or after him? Or has he been revived only to serve as a tourist attraction? A great image to put on the chocolate boxes or on the apple cider bottles? While it is true that many a souvenir portrayed bowman or his crossbow one way or another, it is also true that for modern-day Swiss, William Tell is not just a publicity stunt. What he stood for in the 13th century holds true today. In a different era, with different struggles, Swiss people still see Wilhelm Tell with his crossbow and boundless sense of justice as their hero. In the end, I think there can be no higher compliment than this. So this was the tale of William Tell, bowman extraordinaire and national hero. We're now at the end of the very first episode, and I thank you for your attention, my fellow travelers. A journey becomes a pleasure when you travel with other people. I thank you all also for having stuck with me until now. This project has been a long time in the making, and all the research that has gone into this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor of Medieval History. If you have loved listening to this podcast as much as I've loved making it, then please hit the subscribe button and maybe leave a comment if you will. I will love reading them. I will wait for you in 2 weeks when we will change country and expand our horizons, not just to Europe, but to the world itself. In our next journey, we will meet the hero of 2 worlds. Until then, goodbye everyone. Safe travels.